Steve has defined the lobby and made the case that it has a powerful influence on U.S. Middle East policy. I'd like to take the analysis a step further and argue that its influence has been largely negative. In a nutshell, our argument is that the lobby, working with Israel itself, has pushed U.S. Middle East policy in ways that are not in the American national interest, and I might add, not in Israel's interest either. I will focus on two cases tonight. First, how U.S. support for Israel's policies against the Palestinians in the occupied territories has fueled our terrorism problem. And second, the run-up to the Iraq War and the influence that Israel and the lobby played in that set of events. There are three cases that we talk about in the book that I will not address in my formal presentation, but we can certainly talk about in the Q&A. That's U.S. policy toward Iran, U.S. policy towards Syria, and U.S. policy during the Lebanon War in the summer of 2006. Let me start with America's terrorism problem. The conventional wisdom among Israel's supporters is that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians has little to do with why the United States is so hated in the Arab and Islamic world, and more importantly, little to do with our terrorism problem. In fact, Israel is said to be a valuable ally in America's fight against terrorism. Indeed, it is said to be the most important ally by far in the Middle East. This received wisdom, however, is wrong. There is an abundance of survey data and anecdotal evidence that shows U.S. support for Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and U.S. support for Israel's efforts to colonize those territories angers, if not enrages, huge numbers of people in the Arab and Islamic world. The State Department, for example, set up an advisory group on public diplomacy in Arab and Islamic countries, which reported in 2006 that, quote, citizens in these countries are genuinely distressed at the plight of the Palestinians and at the role they perceive the United States to be playing. Not surprisingly, that anger helps fuel terrorism against the United States. Let me emphasize that I am not making the argument that our support for Israel's policy towards the Palestinians is the only cause of our terrorism problem. I am simply saying that it is a major cause. Specifically, it motivates some individuals to attack the United States. It serves as a powerful recruitment device for terrorist organizations, and it generates sympathy and support for terrorists among huge numbers of people in the Arab world. The hostility towards the United States generated by Israel's policies in the occupied territories has been recognized by American presidents since 1967, when Israel first conquered the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. This is why the official policy of every U.S. president since Lyndon Johnson has been to oppose settlement building in the occupied territories. But no president has been able to put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements. Indeed, as Steve pointed out, the U.S. has protected Israel from criticism at the United Nations and given Israel more foreign aid than any other country and given it unconditionally. Of course, the reason why no president can put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements, even though that's official American policy, is the lobby. A critically important issue when talking about America's terrorism problem is the matter of how U.S. support for Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians relates to what happened on September 11th. It is commonplace to hear Israel's supporters say that, number one, Osama bin Laden did not care much about the Palestinians until recently, and he only cares now because it is an effective recruiting device. Two, the events on 9/11 had nothing to do with Israel. And three, Those involved in the attack on 9/11 hate us because of who we are, not because of our Middle East policies. These lines of argument are frequently purveyed by key figures in the lobby. For example, Robert Satloff from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy claims that bin Laden's identification with the Palestinians is, quote, a recent and almost surely opportunistic phenomenon. Alan Dershowitz maintains that, quote, prior to September 11th, Israel was barely on bin Laden's radar screen, end of quote. And Dennis Ross, who also works at the Washington Institute, says that bin Laden was merely, quote, trying to gain legitimacy by implying that this attack on America was about the plight of the Palestinians. These claims, however, are simply not true. It is clear from the historical record that bin Laden has been deeply concerned about the plight of the Palestinians since he was a young man. That concern was reflected in public statements of his throughout the 1990s, well before 9/11. Consider what Max Rodenbeck, the Middle East correspondent for The Economist magazine, wrote in a review of 2 books about bin Laden, one which was a compilation of his major speeches. I'm reading now from Rodenbeck's review. Of all the themes, the notion of payback for injustices suffered by the Palestinians is perhaps the most powerfully recurrent in bin Laden's speeches. Regarding the actual attack on 9/11, we now know from the work of the 9/11 Commission that U.S. support for Israel was a major cause of those attacks. It was not the only cause for sure, but it was a key cause. For example, the 9/11 Commission reports that bin Laden wanted to make sure that Congress was a target of the attackers because it is the most important source of support for Israel in the United States. The Commission also reports that bin Laden twice wanted to move up the date of the attack because of events involving Israel, even though doing so would have increased the risk of failure. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, consider what the 9/11 Commission report says about the motives of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who it describes as the principal architect of the attacks. To quote the Commission report, by his own account, KSM's animus towards the United States stemmed not from his experiences there as a student, but rather from his violent disagreement with U.S. foreign policy favoring Israel. Again, that's from the 9/11 Commission report, and that's a statement on what KSM's motives were. It is hard to imagine more compelling evidence of the role that U.S. support for Israel played in the 9/11 attacks. In short, the present relationship between Washington and Jerusalem is helping to fuel America's terrorism problem. Let me now turn to Iraq. It is manifestly clear to most Americans that the Iraq War is one of the greatest strategic blunders in American history. Our argument is that Israel, and especially the lobby, were 2 of the main driving forces behind the decision to invade Iraq. It is hard to imagine that war happening, we argue, in their absence. To start with Israel itself, it was the only country, besides Kuwait, where both the government and a majority of the population favored the war. The Israeli government, to include Prime Minister Sharon, pushed the Bush administration hard to make sure that it did not lose its nerve in the months before the invasion. Other influential Israelis, like former Prime Ministers Ehud Barak and Benjamin Netanyahu, also implored the United States to take down Saddam. In fact, Israel was pushing so hard for war that Israel's allies in the United States warned Israeli officials to damp down their rhetoric lest it be seen as a war for Israel. I might also note that in 2006, former President Bill Clinton said that every Israeli politician I knew favored a war against Iraq, even if Saddam did not have WMD. The Israeli public was also solidly behind the war, according to a February 2003 poll, that is 1 month before the war started. 77.5% of Israelis said that they wanted the United States to attack Iraq. One sometimes hears the argument, as I'm sure many of you have, that Israel opposed the Iraq war and actually favored attacking Iraq instead. Attacking Iran instead. There is no question that in early 2002, when the Israelis first got wind that the Bush administration was thinking about attacking Iraq, that key Israeli officials went to Washington and made it clear to the Bush administration and others that they thought Iran was the greater enemy and that the Bush administration should focus on Tehran, not on Baghdad. It is important to emphasize, however, that Israel was not opposed to the United States toppling the regimes in Iraq or Syria, two countries that Jerusalem considers mortal enemies. Israel simply wanted the United States to deal with Iran first. But once the Israelis realized that the war party intended to deal with Iran after it finished the job in Iraq, it enthusiastically embraced the idea of invading Iraq. Thus, between early 2002 and March 2003, the Israelis put significant pressure on the Bush administration to make sure that it chose war over diplomacy with regard to Iraq, while reminding Washington along the way at numerous points that it had to make sure that it did Iran after it finished Iraq. I might add that there is no evidence that Israel warned the United States that Iraq would turn into a quagmire. Indeed, the reason the Israelis were confident that the United States would deal with Iran after they finished with Iraq was because the Israelis thought that we were going to encounter a cakewalk in Iraq. Turning now to the lobby, there is no question that the neoconservatives, one of the core constituencies in the lobby, were the main driving force behind that war. But they were supported by key organizations in the lobby, such as AIPAC. Now that the war has gone south, it is common to hear Israel's supporters say that the main organizations in the lobby did not push for war. But that's not true. This point is made clear in a May 2004 editorial written in The Forward, a Jewish weekly newspaper based in New York. I'm going to read to you from the Forward editorial, again, written in May 2004. As President Bush attempted to sell the war in Iraq, America's most important Jewish organizations rallied as one to his defense. In statement after statement, community leaders stressed the need to rid the world of Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction. Concern for Israel's safety rightfully factored in to the deliberations of the main Jewish groups. One sometimes hears the claim these days that AIPAC took no position on the Iraq war and certainly did not advocate it. This is not true either. First of all, this claim fails the common sense test, as AIPAC usually supports what Israel wants, and Israel certainly wanted the United States to invade Iraq. Second, and more importantly, there is hard evidence that AIPAC lobbied for the war. For example, AIPAC's executive director, this is AIPAC's executive director, not Steve Walt or John Mearsheimer, AIPAC's executive director, Howard Kaur, told the New York Sun in January 2003 that one of AIPAC's successes over the past year was, quote, quietly lobbying Congress to approve the use of force in Iraq. The neoconservatives, of course, were the main driving force behind the war. They initiated the idea of using force to topple Saddam in 2 letters written to President Clinton in early 1998. Over the next 5 years, and especially after 9/11, they pushed relentlessly for a war against Iraq. No other group or institution in the United States was seriously committed to invading Iraq over that 5-year period. Indeed, there was significant opposition to invading Iraq even after 9/11 within the State Department, the intelligence community, and the uniformed military.